What if you could decide the fate of the Soviet Union? What if instead of the USSR collapsing on a December day in 1991, you could rewrite history and guide it to winning the Cold War, successfully reforming it into a capitalist state? Or maybe you become the next Stalin and rule with an iron fist and expand the Warsaw Pact and continue to clamp down on freedoms. It's all up to you in Crisis in the Kremlin, the Cold War. It isn't just a strategy game, it's honestly one of the most realistic simulations of the USSR ever made. Not that there's many. First, I do want to give a bit of background information. Now, hopefully most of you know what the Cold War is. According to my metrics, like 20% of you guys were alive for it, so hopefully you remember something. But the Cold War was a period of hostility between two superpowers, the United States of America and the United Soviet Socialist Republic, otherwise known as the Soviet Union or USSR. I will be using those interchangeably. It was a battle of ideologies between the Communist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States. Now, do feel free to argue on whether or not each of those states were actually communist or capitalist, but that's typically how the narrative is presented. At the game's start in 1985, historically, Gorbachev was General Secretary or President of the Soviet Union. But in-game, you can pick who you want to play as among historical figures, or create your own. But in 1985, the Soviet Union was in a tough spot. Much of its budget was being spent on the military, which led to a decrease in the quality of life. The Soviet Union was also heavily involved in fighting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. That might sound familiar because that group eventually became the Taliban, or at least parts of it. It's often thought of as the Soviet Union Vietnam. While the Soviet Union is still a superpower in 1985, it is experiencing massive pain, such as importing food just to stay afloat, massive corruption, and a citizenship ready for change. Now in our timeline, this eventually culminated in the dissolution of the Soviet Union after many member republic states declared independence, and after a series of reforms, military hardliners attempted to stop reforms in Moscow by marching the military there, but Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federal Republic, joined citizens to stop them. So that is a pretty basic rendition of all the woes affecting the Soviet Union at the time. And because we can all look at a map, we know that the reforms of the Soviet Union were too little too late. But you can change that. So let's talk about the actual mechanics of this game. This game, like most grand strategy games, has you looking at a map. But the meat of this game is in events and the Doctrines screen. There is also a pretty interesting political system. Unlike most grand strategy games, this game is not all about war. Of course, there is some of that. But this game is mostly about politics. So in-game, there's going to be multiple factions that you can either support or ally with or oppose. First, there's the neo-Stalinists who want to return to the glory days and want a strong ruler who will bring the nation to glory through communism and have a hardline foreign stance against the Western world. Then there is the conservatives, who mostly want things to stay the same and for the USSR to remain a strong socialist state. And they want basically zero reforms unless it makes socialism more efficient. Then there is also the moderates. They want some reform and are fine with a more state capitalist system where private industries and the state walk together hand in hand, but they want an end to the hardline foreign stance against the US. Then there's the reformers, who want the Soviet Union to fully transition into a democracy and want more capitalist policies. These are the main factions. There are a couple more, but they're irrelevant unless you're really trying to court them. Like there's some fascists, there's some monarchists, there's some informal socialists. But again, those are the four main factions you're going to be dealing with, and each of these factions is made up of a dozen members who you can appoint to positions of power, like Secretary of Defense or Minister of Foreign Affairs. And of course, this still is the Soviet Union, so they're all trying to jockey more control from behind the scenes by using the conspiracy system. So whether they just want to try to make you exile other politicians, or they just want to gain more power while you're ruling. So even while you're attempting to save the USSR from collapse, there's always something going on in the background. With politics, you can also use that to change the doctrine of your country. There's dozens of different policies, so whether it's determining how long the draft is for citizens, or even if there should be a draft, or maybe you're changing how party politics works, and you're making yourself the lifelong president. Or maybe you're introducing a more Western democracy style. Or maybe you're changing from a more centrally planned economic system to full-blown free market capitalism. There are dozens of doctrines for everything. There's also modifiers, and these represent the political and economic reforms that your country has from before you took control. So in the modifier menu, you can see things like currently there is a draft for students. You can change that, so maybe students shouldn't get drafted. Or maybe you want to cut all the privileges the country has given to bureaucrats to make them loyal. There's dozens of modifiers, and you get to determine how you deal with them. All these doctrines and modifiers affect the economy of your country, and other things like how your allies perceive you, or how loyal the state apparatuses are, like the military or generals. And of course, it's really important to make sure the country is loyal, because they will cause issues and make you more ineffective the more disloyal they are. Now, there are multiple ways to fix that, and it all ties into the economy system of this game, which is also pretty in-depth, and of course, everything is all connected. So when you first open your budget screen, either after you buy the game or download the demo, you might get overwhelmed because there is a lot of numbers, but it's all pretty self-explanatory and it tells you what it does. There's also a bribe or influence section of the budget, which this is how you can make sure that the military and KGB are loyal. You can just send them money and they stay loyal, you just bribe them. You can also manage the budget of your industry and how you're researching things, so the more budget you give to your industry, the better it does, and same for research. It's a pretty simple system on the surface, but again, every budget decision affects the rest of your game. It affects what the population thinks, it affects how good your economy is doing, it affects how strong your military is. Everything affects everything. Speaking of what your people think about you, social unrest is a pretty big part of this game, and as the real Soviet Union had to deal with, it's pretty terrible. Many members of the Soviet Republic want freedom. As nationalism rises, countries like Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, and all the rest of the Soviet member states have difficulties and typically want more freedom from Russia. You also have to deal with these countries getting more liberal influence from the United States and Europe, and then you also have to deal with the people calling out for change. If your policies are too repressive, this will lead to them marching on Moscow and demanding change. One moment, you're celebrating economic reforms that you were just able to pass, and then the next moment, your streets are flooded with protesters, and you have to choose between compromise, giving in to them, or maybe you just want to roll in the tanks. You also have to manage foreign policy. You have to deal with the United States under threat of nuclear war, you have to manage trade deals and relations with countries across the world. You're also managing foreign interventions across the globe, from Ethiopia to Nicaragua. And all these systems interconnect. If you reform too fast, your economy and country will collapse. If you don't reform at all, your country will quickly collapse into chaos as member states declare independence and you're quickly ousted from power. This whole game is a balancing act. And now, it obviously does deal with some alternate history, since the whole premise of the game is to stop the USSR from collapsing, which it obviously did. But you still have to deal with many of the real issues and events that caused the fall of the USSR, like the Afghan War or the reform programs implemented before your premiership begins. The Soviet Union had attempted to fix the country before, and it is still affecting you, for good and for bad. You get to decide if you want to keep these programs or axe them. But, as I said, there's a lot of alt history shenanigans that you can get up to. You can collapse the USA into a balkanized version of itself. The South will declare independence. There will be like 5 nations that make up what used to be the US. You can bring China under your sphere of influence. You can make the world communist. You can even have a permanent colony on the moon and send people to Mars. You can even bring the monarchy back. Almost anything is possible. And also, your decisions also influence the American election. So maybe Michael Dukakis defeats George H.W. Bush for the presidency after Reagan ends his 2 terms. Or maybe things get so bad that the Republican and Democrat Party break up and the election becomes a battle between Donald Trump and Ron Paul. That would have been a crazy world to live in. There is so much freedom and choice, and there's so many endings you can get. From successfully reforming the USSR into a prospering socialist democracy, or you can turn it into a hardline communist state, or even a monarchy with communist characteristics. Or maybe something more realistic will happen. Maybe it'll collapse. Or maybe your game will end when a revolution topples your government. Or maybe you just lose an election. Almost anything can happen. Every decision you make feels weighty, and it feels like it really affects the rest of the game. There are no perfect options. Every choice is a trade-off, and it really exemplifies one of my favorite political quotes by Thomas Sowell. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. And this game lives by that saying. The game really tries to put you in the shoes of the last presidents of the USSR, attempting to keep this bloated corpse moving, and unlike in real life, maybe you'll actually succeed. Crisis in the Kremlin may be the most realistic Soviet simulator ever made. Not because it has flashy graphics or there's a bunch of insane action, but because it captures the impossible decisions of leading a dying empire. If you're at all interested in political simulators, you have to try it. There's even a demo you can try out, but be warned, you are going to be restarting multiple times. The game seems really complicated, but trust me, it isn't. You just have to get an understanding of how the moving parts all fit together. And then also, this does have a pretty heavy Russian demographic who plays the game for obvious reasons. So if you do join the Reddit or go to the discussion page on Steam, there's going to be a lot of Russian, just a forewarning. Also, a lot of communist and socialist sympathizers who play, so if that's your bag, that's great. If not, just be warned. So with all that, if you were in charge, could you save the Soviet Union? Well, now's your chance to test out your political acumen and try the game. Seriously, it's a lot of fun, it's pretty cheap, can't recommend it enough if you enjoy politics of any variety. Because again, it's up to you. You don't have to play as a socialist republic. You can fully reform into capitalism. You can show America how it's done. So really, try it out. That's all I have. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, all that YouTuber nonsense. And please remember that Jesus loves you.